Well, you've been introduced to fungi generally as a kingdom, but next up we're going to be taking a look at the variety of phyla within kingdom fungi. Phylum, traditionally the next level of classification below kingdom. So, phylum basidiomycota is the first one that we're going to look at, and it produces spores called basidiospores in club-like structures called basidia. So, a basidia would be the result of sexual reproduction between mycelia. So, the mycelia are growing, they're extending their hypha. So, you've got two hypha from unique fungi. They meet, they join together, and they're able to exchange nuclei through a kind of opening. That results in the formation of a basidia, which would be where some spores are released. So mushrooms, puffballs, shelf fungi are all examples of fruiting bodies within phylum Basidiomycota. So this should be kind of a familiar phylum to you. They are mostly saprophytic, although some are parasitic. So fungi like mushrooms, puffballs, shelf fungi, those are usually growing like out in the woods, on dead trees. Those would be saprophytic, but if we were to look at some parasitic ones, we might be looking at a group like rusts or smuts. Those are parasitic fungi that grow on plants. So a good example of one of them would be wheat rust. Wheat rust produces a red spore called a uretispore. And when wheat turns yellow, rust forms a teleospore that will actually survive the winter. So these will grow on the underside of the leaves of a barberry bush, forming aciospores, which infect wheat plants. So this would be the kind of thing that farmers would have to deal with in terms of like spraying a fungicide on their trees and their crops like that, because these parasitic fungi are able to infect plants and potentially even ruin a crop. So next phylum up is phylum ascomycota. So they form spores in a structure that resembles a sac. It's called an asci. And there are single-celled varieties called yeasts. Perhaps you've heard of them as well. So they can also reproduce by asexual budding. The kind of yeast that you're familiar with is called baker's yeast, and it has a name that I'm going to do my best to say, but no promises. It's Nope. Anyway, so you can just see how it's spelled and try to pronounce it yourself. So there are some edible fungi that belong to this phylum. I wouldn't recommend eating yeast by itself, but it's safe to put in food, obviously. So also in phylum Ascomycota, we've got Claviceps purpurae, also known as ergot of rye, which can cause a disease, and Ophiostoma ulmi, heaven help me, which is called Dutch elm disease, and Cryphonectria parasitica, or chestnut blight. See, I can say the Latin words, not the normal ones, that affect trees. So far we've seen some that are familiar, even edible, and some that are unfamiliar and are harmful to plants. So next phylum up is phylum Zygomycota. So these form spores called zygospores. Remember, Basidiomycota formed basidiospores. Now Zygomycota is forming zygospores, so even the spores are different. And this is formed where hyphae fuse. A good example of phylum Zygomycota would be the genus Rhizopus. And if you were to look up a picture of Zygomycota, you'd be seeing the kind of fuzzy mold that you're used to seeing on spoiled food. Right, so the next up is phylum Chytridiomycota. I'm really trying my best on that. I hope that's close. So they form spores with a flagellum, actually. They form spores with flagella. They are single-celled fungi called chytrids, and they are typically saprophytic. They feed on decaying water plants. There is one example called Syncytrium endobioticum, which is a parasite, and that causes potato wart. Let's see. So far, we've seen wheat rust. We've seen a disease that affects rye and chestnut and elm trees. Potatoes, too. Man, these poor plants, they can't catch a break. So the next phylum that we're going to talk about is called phylum Deuteromycota, also known as imperfect fungi. So here's the deal with these fungi. They've all been classified according to how they reproduce. Well, in this particular group, their form of reproduction is not classified. So this is basically the other group, the group that doesn't fit neatly according to any rules that define a larger group. So this is just the, I don't know, call it Deuteromycota. Hopefully that doesn't bother you. So one particular genus of phylum Deuteromycota is Penicillium. That might sound familiar to you because Alexander Fleming, a scientist, noticed that blue mold in this phylum produced an antibacterial chemical. So he isolated it, he called it penicillin, and that was the first antibiotic. So we actually owe a lot to fungi in this regard. Camembert and Roquefort, I am pronouncing everything incorrectly today. They are cultured dairy products, obviously. They're cheese, and they are cultured with fungus from this phylum. Okay, this next one is just a bit tricky. This is phylum Myxomycota. They are called slime molds. And the thing is, they grow in moist habitats on the decaying remains of living creatures, usually trees. So they'll be like growing on the surface of dead tree bark. They are saprophytic, meaning they consume the bodies of dead organisms. And in some cases, they exist as parasites on living plants. They are brightly colored, and they are slimy to the touch, though I'm not sure I would actually want to touch one. So they are usually white, red, orange, or yellow. So this is going to be the last phylum that we're going to talk about, and it's a little odd that I included it in this slide. This presentation on the phyla of fungi, because it's not actually really a fungus, even though it's called a slime mold. So why are we talking about it right now? I'll tell you. They exhibit characteristics that could qualify them as a protist, but also kind of remind you of a fungus. So just as a reminder, life evolved however it evolved. It didn't have a rule book. It didn't have a plan. And so we came to it after the fact, trying to classify things. Now, you might cry foul and say, this creature, this organism, it doesn't fit neatly into our categories. Well, guess what? Our categories are wrong. So depending on what we discover or what we discover about a creature that we already knew about, we might need to reconsider our categories. And in this particular instance, this thing that really seems like a fungus actually maybe isn't, and maybe it should have been in the protist section. So let's just go over a couple details about it before we close. First, they resemble a protozoa until they produce sporophores. So in their feeding stage, that's when they're eating, obviously, they exist as a mass called plasmodium. So this is not to be confused with a protist genus of the same name. There is a genus of protists called Plasmodium. This is not referring to that. This is the name of the large feeding stage mass that they have. They can move as a unit in search for food. Fungus is not supposed to move. So that's one important distinction, obviously. So when the food supply is exhausted or unfavorable conditions arise, they form sporophores. That might remind you of the endospores that bacteria form. So this thing that's called a mold, it's kind of actually a protist, but it does bacteria stuff. What is it? I don't know. It's alive. That's what it is. Some of the spores are actually even able to move independently. That's not something that a fungal spore can do. So, phylum Myxomycota for you. Protist or fungus? Not really a fungus, more like a protist, but boy is it like a fungus, depending on how you look at it. Some of the other spores are non-modal, which actually you'd expect. Okay, well, like I said, that's the last phylum that we're going to talk about. And the next time we talk about fungi, we'll be talking about their relationships with other organisms.